Contrary to what I think my output on this channel might reflect, I actually started getting into visual novels fairly late in life. My first one was Danganronpa V3 back in 2022 at the youthful age of 24, and since then I've fallen pretty deep into them during my time as a content creator. After V3, I played Danganronpas 1 and 2, then played my first on-stream visual novel back in early 2023 with Zero Escape 999. From there, I played The Somnium Files, then back to Virtue's Last Reward, then Nirvana Initiative, then Zero Time Dilemma, and the list goes on from there. Most of what I've played has been Kodaka or Ichigoshi stuff from either Spike Chunsoft or Tokyo Games, but I've also been able to get into a little bit of Ace Attorney, Your Turn to Die, and just generally I've kind of been broadening my horizons a bit. However, something I've always found a bit, curious, I guess, is how this genre of games has a bit of a unique relationship to mental illness and cognitive disorders, both in terms of how they're narratively used as well as how they portray the people involved. It's most noticeable for me in the straight-up killing games, but even in other visual novels, it crops up from time to time in a way that's pretty similar to how it's used in the killing game and death game stories. It's been one of the topics that's actually been bouncing around in my head pretty much since I started the channel, or at least since I started playing more of these games, but I've never really been certain what the best way to talk about it would be. After all, a lot of the time their impact on the narrative is often too specific to talk about it in a way that would feel conclusive about a broader theme. Characters like Ace in 999 with his prosopagnosia, or Rohan Kumakura in The Somnium Files with his hemispatial neglect, or Toko Fukawa in Danganronpa with their dissociative identity disorder are all interesting to talk about, but drawing a connecting line between them is, tricky to say the least. Psychological conditions are a multifaceted subject that resists oversimplification or just lumping everyone together, and given that it's obviously a bit of a sensitive subject, I wanted to make sure that if I was going to talk about it, I had a good, concrete platform to jump off of. And in September, I got that platform handed to me on a silver platter. A little over 3 months ago, as of time of release, hopefully, I got an email from Fospo, a Taiwanese studio, asking if I'd be interested in trying out their new game, Psycho-Sleuth, a killing game narrative where the whole gimmick revolves around the participants each being afflicted with a unique cognitive disorder. Before even playing the game, I knew this was going to be how I'd finally get to make this video, especially because some of the wording in the email and Steam page really had me feeling a bit on the fence about how well the subject would be handled. So that's what this video is going to be. We're going to be discussing the demo for Psycho-Sleuth, which covers the prologue as well as the first chapter up to the trial, as well as characters from a bunch of other games who tie into this discussion. I'll be focusing on the characters in isolation as much as possible, but given how the conditions these characters experience is directly part of not only their personal narrative, but often the overarching conflict of the story, it's somewhat inevitable that there will be some spoilers related to these games. Specifically, there will be spoilers for 999 and Zero Time Dilemma in the Zero Escape series, Danganronpas 1 and V3, The Somnium Files and Nirvana Initiative, and also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde if that's a concern for you. Hopefully you're okay with some spoilers given the nature of the subject, but regardless, this is your heads up that you might have Zero Time Dilemma ruined for you. Tragedy, I know. As well as a heads up, this video will obviously be covering some fairly sensitive subjects and discussing some portrayals of conditions like DID that are themselves fairly insensitive. I want to make it clear up front that this is not me endorsing these portrayals, and since I don't have any of these conditions myself, at least as far as I know, I'm not a psychiatrist, I want it to also be clear to my audience that I am not the authority on the subject. I am not a psychologist, and while I do my research as much as possible, I can't speak for the lived experiences of the people who actually have some of these conditions or have lived with people who do. I know some people kind of roll their eyes at these sorts of disclosures, but I want to make sure that everyone is crystal clear on my limitations on the subject and my awareness of my limitations. I also have reached out to Fospo, the developers of Psycho-Sleuth, with a handful of questions to see if I can get some more insight into how you go about developing a game like this, so where it's applicable, I'll try and sprinkle their answers in. Anyways, let's get into it. Part 1. Psycho-Sleuth and Pathosyncs. The best place to start is with Psycho-Sleuth itself, and specifically with explaining its premise to you since it's kind of a bit misleadingly described on Steam. The premise of the game is that at some point after the global takeover by a cult named Lee, which I believe the game also describes as the Church of Order, but we're just going to call it the Church for simplicity's sake, they invite 13 people to participate in a game to ascend to godhood and get one wish granted by their dear leader. They are to participate in a killing game, albeit one with a unique structure based on the game Werewolf. Each cycle of the game will involve one person being selected as the werewolf, with the others either being given no role or a hero role that can kill the werewolf. The werewolf is tasked with killing their victim within 24 hours, but will be able to ask the church's staff and attendants for any help they might need to carry it out in order to level the playing field. If the werewolf fails, they will be executed. If they succeed, a trial will commence where you will have to investigate to figure out who did it. And from what I can find, or at least from what I can tell about how it's explained, in the game's first trial, the two heroes will have to vote for who they think did it. If they disagree, or they refuse to kill the werewolf, or one of the heroes is dead, the werewolf can win. I think. The phrasing around it is a bit confusing on that front, and since the first proper trial isn't in the game yet, it's hard to know if that's actually correct. Plus, the way that it's described makes me kind of think that there's meant to be some sort of a twist related to it, so take that description with a grain of salt. Regardless, the big gimmick of this game is that each of the participants is what's known as a pathosync user, and this is what we're here to talk about. The game describes it as a cognitive disorder or cognitive distortion mechanic, but even though the marketing describes it as if it's just talking about the regular impairments themselves, it really isn't. Like, the promotional material talks about conditions like OCD or synesthesia or hemispatial neglect as though those are the conditions that the characters have that are playing a role in this. But the reality is that it's taking all these conditions to the extreme, turning them into something different. And they typically reach a breaking point where it either kills them, gets them killed, or it manifests as a pathosync. This game also contains a warning at the beginning that people in conditions depicted are fictional and not representative of reality, but they do still use the same names, and oftentimes the pathosyncs operate very similarly to the real-world conditions. Not always, some of them are very different, but some of them are basically just the same thing but contagious. When I spoke to Postpost producer Alex Liu, this was the aspect of it I think I asked about the most. Whenever I'm using a quote from those questions, by the way, I'll put the full written question and answer on the screen, just so that way I can refer to what's said without having to read out the whole thing verbatim and still maintain the full context. For example, I asked a question about how I had noticed that some pathosyncs diverged wildly from their related conditions while others were fairly similar, and I was wondering why that was the case. Alex told me that the priority was to focus on the aspect of a particular condition that would be conducive to the murder mystery and to the narrative as a whole, pointing to how a more literal interpretation of OCD could manifest as something like compulsive hand-washing, which doesn't really lend itself to a murder mystery. So they went with lying. Or rather, always telling the truth. Where it was necessary for the narrative, they stretched it further, and where they felt like it worked better to keep it closer to the original real condition, they kept it there. For this section, we're going to go through the game's pathosyncs, their associated disorders, and a short breakdown of how they manifest in-game and which characters are associated with them. Importantly, not every character's pathosync is known, and more conditions and pathosyncs are described than there are characters present, indicating that it's possible that either more will show up or that characters can double up on conditions. Each character's profile contains tabs for disorder and pathosync, further establishing that they are linked but distinct, as well as a stabilizer which seems to be someone or something that anchors their abilities in some way. The game also apparently ranks the pathosyncs from S tier to D tier, seemingly by how powerful and or dangerous they are, so we'll go through them starting from the lowest tier to the highest. Starting off in D tier, we have face erasure, camera phobia, perfect memory, blind sight, and evidentiary occlusion. Face erasure is the pathosync form of prosopagnosia, a condition that makes you unable to recognize faces. The pathosync itself takes it a step further by making it so that anything that even resembles a face becomes impossible to identify, but this one isn't super far off from the real-world condition it's based on. In-game, this ability affects Phase, a little girl who's looking for her lost family but has no idea what they look like, so she just photographs everyone and hopes that other people can recognize who she's talking about. And it's a condition she shares with Ace from Zero Escape 999 as well. Camera phobia is pretty straightforward, phobia of cameras, because for this one, the pathosync and disorder are very similar. However, for the pathosync users, it can extend to any sort of electronic recording device, not just cameras, and it can eventually turn them into shut-ins. This ability afflicts Alice, an actor who exclusively performs on stage because there's no cameras present. Perfect memory is, again, pretty obvious. It's what it says on the tin. It's built out of hyperthymesia, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, which just describes having a near-perfect memory. So perfect memory is basically just that, but actually perfect. The game describes it as a curse because it makes it impossible for memories to be forgotten. I think that this ability is implied to belong to Silas, an old soldier whose wish if he wins the game is to be able to forget, but there's no guarantee. Blind sight is another condition where both the name and concept are pretty much identical across pathosync and real-world condition. It basically just describes someone whose vision is damaged in a way that prevents their conscious mind from being able to see much or even at all, but still allows their subconscious mind to see and react to visual stimulus. In-game, this ability belongs to Eris, who can really only see Lyle and Lena for some reason and lists them as her stabilizers, although she only lists Lyle as a weakness. Evidentiary occlusion is based on aphantasia, a condition defined by the inability to visualize mental images. Have you ever seen that tweet that's like, what do you see in your mind when you imagine an apple, with the 5 pictures each showing a less detailed image of an apple until the last one shows nothing? That last one is describing total aphantasia. This one's actually a lot more common than people realize, in part because, as Francis Galton, the man who identified the condition, once said, lots of people don't realize they have the condition because it's like a colorblind person who's never been made aware of the fact that everyone else is seeing color. Evidentiary occlusion goes beyond this to affect all other senses, allowing you to effectively eliminate your ability to recall the details of a piece of evidence. No confirmation on who this one belongs to, but I think it's to the Detective Hyper, who lists his weakness as memories and who often jumps to whatever conclusions other characters, especially his assistant, reach for him. Next up, in C tier, we have familial dissolution, existential dissociation, omnidistortion disorder, and mnemonic extraction. Familial dissolution is a pathosync that causes families to become suddenly estranged overnight, which the game says likely comes from Frigoli syndrome. However, this is probably an error on their part since they describe the condition as being one in which people mistake people they know for strangers. But Frigoli is actually characterized by believing that multiple people are all the same person in just a series of disguises. They might be referring to Capgras delusion, which is associated with people thinking that their loved ones have been replaced with identical imposters, but it's not super clear because the game doesn't provide much detail aside from it causing families to fall apart because they no longer recognize one another. No character in game has come forward as having this condition so far, but I think you could make the case that it could apply to someone like Silas or FaZe, depending on how you want to interpret it and how the game decides to go with it. Existential dissociation comes from dissociative identity disorder, a condition also colloquially known as multiple personality disorder, but that's not correct anymore, at least, where a person has two or more personalities, often known as alters, inhabiting the same body. You are probably familiar with this one, at least in a pop culture sense, given that it is a long-time staple of murder mysteries. And you're probably also aware that it's usually not exactly presented particularly sensitively. It shows up multiple times in Danganronpa for both Toko Fukawa and Trigger Happy Havoc and Korekyo Shinguji and Killing Harmony, kind of, we'll get to him later, but it's probably the most common psychological condition used in media at this point aside from sociopathy or schizophrenia. Existential dissociation, by contrast, goes a step further. The person is capable of detaching the additional personality from themselves and having it be perceived by both themselves and everyone else as a distinct person without anyone noticing anything incorrect about the situation. Nobody knows that is not a real person, basically. No idea why this one's only considered C tier, because that seems like a lot, but whatever. Nobody has been explicitly identified with this disorder either, but I have a theory that Lyle might have it, and that's where Lena and potentially even Eris come from. But we'll get there in a bit. Omnidistortion disorder comes from Alice in Wonderland syndrome, a condition related to distorted perception where scale is basically impossible for you to judge. A large object may appear small, or a distant one might appear to be close, and you might feel your body constantly expanding or shrinking. This is another one where the pathosync is basically identical to the real-world condition, just to the highest degree. And so far, no character has been associated with this one either. Mnemonic extraction is basically just weaponized amnesia. You can forcibly remove your own memories if you want to, but you can also forcibly remove other people's memories via the transferability stuff. Again, we'll get there in a bit. The game says that it's possible for the user to forget they even used the ability or that they have it in the first place, but who knows? This ability might belong to Hyper, again, for the same reasons that I mentioned about the other one. You know, he doesn't necessarily have a good time with memories, but nothing established in stone. It is known that it's in use, though. It shows up in the game's first round of Werewolf, so someone who has it is playing a role in all of this. In B tier, we have Rule Binding Syndrome, Cryptic Erotomania, Beast Delusion, and Factitious Pathogenesis. Rule Binding Syndrome is the one based on OCD, which is pretty straightforward. While it manifests differently across the broad spectrum of OCD-related conditions, someone with OCD might be compelled to follow a seemingly arbitrary or inconsequential rule, such as needing to touch a doorknob exactly 10 times or they'll feel like something terrible will happen. Rule Binding Syndrome takes it a step further and makes it literally impossible to violate whatever the individual pathosync user's rule might be. In Psycho-Sleuth's case, this ability belongs to Lena, the protagonist's sister, and her rule is, like I said, she can't lie. That doesn't mean she can't omit the truth, and she can declare something to be true as long as she doesn't know it's false, but she can't knowingly lie. Cryptic erotomania stems from erotomania, a condition in which someone believes that another person is secretly in love with them, typically but not necessarily someone famous or powerful. They'll assume that their lover is sending them coded messages through public presentations or even things like how they park their car, and that all actions somehow reflect their true feelings for the individual. If your thought is, that sounds like just being parasocial in a romantic way, then you're not entirely wrong. IRL, this mostly affects women, and specifically women who are shy, timid, and sexually inexperienced, according to Wikipedia. When it presents in men, they tend to get more violent and stalkery about it, but regardless of gender, it often leads to harassing the person extensively. The pathosync version of it is seemingly identical save for the transferability. Again, we'll get there, so I'm not super sure why this is even a pathosync in the first place. Nobody in-game has been presented with this ability so far, but this one could be a Ray's thing, or it could be an Alice thing if she's doubling up on them. Beast delusion comes from zoanthropy, a condition in which someone believes they either are becoming, or can transform into and out of the form of an animal. Both in-game and IRL, it's usually a wolf, in which case the term for it is apparently clinical lycanthropy. The pathosync form of it gets to the point where the person's behaviors, thoughts, and even possibly physical form continue to shift to resemble the animal, which makes it one of the few pathosyncs to be able to have a tangible physiological effect. This ability is possessed by Dada, who believes herself to be a gray parrot. Or at least, that's what she says, but she does have a wolf hat on as well, and there are some allusions to somebody having the smell of blood on their breath, so we'll see, I guess. Factitious pathogenesis is based on a condition scientifically referred to as factitious disorder imposed on self, but which you probably recognize better under its other name, Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen's is a condition in which someone tries to make themselves appear sick to get attention or sympathy, and the related condition, Munchausen by proxy, is when you do it to someone else for the same reason. Someone who's suffering from FDIS is consciously doing the actions involved, like it's not like they're possessed, but they're not always aware of the motivations behind it. Factitious pathogenesis as a pathosync, meanwhile, is explicitly described as, quote, a conscious choice, a pathology born from intent. Which is a bit weird, given that that's not really the case for FDIS, especially because it's also one of the only pathosyncs based on a condition that it doesn't actually specifically name. It gets even weirder because, as far as I can tell, the game's definition of factitious pathogenesis is only really distinct from FDIS in the sense that it's done knowingly and deliberately, rather than because of an underlying psychological condition that motivates people to do it. Nobody in game seemingly has this ability, but it could come up later. It is also incidentally the only pathosync, as far as I'm aware, where there is a real-world analogy for it being imposed on another person. But, we'll get there, maybe. We'll see. In A tier, we have hypochondriacal delusion, sinistral deletion, and reality collapse. Hypochondriacal delusion, as the name suggests, is very hard to say. And it's also born out of hypochondria, a condition in which you are convinced that you are sick, typically very seriously sick, in spite of any number of tests that prove you're healthy. It's a condition that we tend to toss around a lot. People will say that they're hypochondriac because they think that they are constantly coming down with something. But in terms of the actual condition, it's a lot more serious than just assuming that you're probably dying every time you have a cold. As a pathosync, hypochondriacal delusion, which I feel like I'm putting the emphasis in the wrong spot in that one. I've said it a million times. We're going with this. Basically, it just extends to the point of manifesting the symptoms onto the body to create the illness that you believe you have, even potentially killing you if it's a fatal one. In other words, if you thought you had cancer and you had this pathosync, you could manifest actual cancer. The game says that if this spread, it could cause a panic on the level of the Black Death. No character has been identified as having this one. Sinistral deletion comes from hemispatial neglect, a condition typically caused by a traumatic brain injury or stroke, in which a person's brain stops perceiving either the left or right side, typically the left. This could be as simple as just not being able to see the left side of something, but still conceptually understanding it to be there, or could go to the extent of not really being able to grapple with the left side of things, even though you can see them. It can lead to things like not eating food on the left side of a plate, running into door frames with your left side because you misjudge your positioning, not shaving the left side of your face or your left leg, drawing all the numbers on the clock on the right side or only drawing 1 to 6 and leaving the left side blank, stuff like that. The left side of your body is frequently still functional, like you can still use your left leg to walk, but your brain just kind of doesn't really make the connection. The pathosync version, sinistral deletion, is basically just the most severe version of the real-world condition, where there is zero capacity to conceptualize the left side of anything. Kind of. The character with this condition, Kizuna, is aware in theory that the left side of things exists. She manipulates another character into turning a wheel to the left in order to activate something because she knows the wheel can do something, but she isn't capable of turning it left to do it herself, and hides to Lyle's left when she afflicts him with it because she knows he can't perceive her there. But she will leave behind evidence like the right side of a corpse because it is to her left, so she just doesn't grasp that it's there or even capable of being there. This is also the condition that Rohan Kumakura in I, the Somnium Files experienced, although in his case it was combined with some other brain damage that led him to kill women and rip out their left eyeballs because of it. Reality collapse comes from derealization, a condition characterized by feeling like you are no longer experiencing reality. Wikipedia says that it's often described as being like experiencing life through VR goggles or a pane of glass or a TV screen, and while it's possible for it to be chronic, it's frequently temporary as a stress or trauma response and is often accompanied by depersonalization or other dissociative conditions. Reality collapse as a pathosync basically just extends the distance from reality, making all senses feel like they are detached and reducing motivation, emotional attachment, and fear of consequences. This one afflicts Elian, or Elian, I'm not sure exactly how to say it. Whatever, it's Hyper's assistant, and he actually lets Lyle experience it for a brief second. Lyle does not find this experience particularly enjoyable. In S tier, we have world fabrication, death delusion, alien hand syndrome, and limb severance. World fabrication comes from synesthesia, a condition where your senses basically just accidentally trigger each other. You've probably heard of this one before. You might be able to see sounds, smell colors, feel perfumes, stuff like that. In game, if your synesthesia creates a feedback loop where all 5 senses trigger each other in a circle, it can evolve into world fabrication, a pathosync where, according to the game, the user's overwhelmingly powerful senses can be used to manifest hallucinations into reality, not just for themselves, but for everyone else. This is the condition of Lyle, the protagonist, who can use it to basically wish whatever he wants into reality, and sometimes things he doesn't want as well. He can manifest a knife into his hands if he wants to hurt someone, and that knife will cut as if it were real. If he, hypothetically accidentally manifests a car that he then gets hit by, it will hurt him and can potentially kill him. His sister Lena created some specialized equipment for him to wear to prevent his senses from being overpowered, and he does actually have a pretty high degree of control over the ability at the time of the game. Death delusion comes from Codard's delusion, a condition in which the person just already believes that they're dead, something which can eventually kill them because they stop taking care of their needs. I mean, they are already dead, so why bother trying to eat? It is extremely rare and typically overlaps with a lot of other conditions, but in-game it takes on a whole new meaning. In fact, I think it's the most separate from the real-world condition by far. The death delusion pathosync is the result of someone who somehow survives after experiencing the depths of Codards and experiencing severe physiological effects, including their heart rate dipping into the single digits and becoming functionally comatose. Once the ability is awakened, as the game describes it, they become a human time bomb. Any human being who touches them will trigger an AoE death delusion where every human being in the area will immediately have their vital systems slow to a crawl, knocking them out and killing them if they're not interrupted. I know it sounds weird that I'm specifying human beings, but it's relevant, I promise. This is the ability of Katari, who gets rolled into the game in a wheelchair and is basically entirely non-functional for most of the time we know her. Alien Hand Syndrome is another one where the pathosync and real-world condition share a name and seemingly also the exact same functions. It's basically just a condition in which limbs act of their own accord in a way that can't be consciously controlled, such as having the left hand involuntarily reach out to touch a hot stove and the right hand having to grab it and try and hold it back. Nobody in game seems to have this one either, but my personal theory at this point is that this is comorbid with the next one we're going to talk about, and that's how the first murder is being enacted, we'll say. We'll get there. There's a lot happening in this first chapter of this game. Anyways, speaking of it, lastly, we have limb severance, which the game says is attached to alien limb disorder, but which is more accurately describing something called body integrity dysphoria, a very rare condition that basically just boils down to discomfort with feeling able-bodied, often manifesting as a desire to have a limb amputated. If the term dysphoria is ringing a bell there, it's probably because there are a lot of other conditions that include it. The term itself just means severe dissatisfaction with or unhappiness, either generalized or on a specific aspect of a person. BID is not super well understood, but according to Wikipedia, people with the condition have resorted to things like letting a train run over their leg to remove it, or damaging a limb so badly that doctors have to amputate it. The pathosync version of it is seemingly only identified in one person, nicknamed the Dismemberer, because we're being very subtle here, whose body integrity dysphoria extends to other people's limbs as well. The Dismemberer is seemingly the first werewolf, given that pretty quickly the other characters start experiencing horrifying hallucinations of their arms and legs as these just disgusting, grotesque appendages that they frantically try and remove with whatever's available. And while the main cast is able to power through, mostly I think, a ton of the church's staff cut off their limbs during the attacks. And then they show up in other places, which is like really fun and cool and definitely not like a little bit stomach churning, but whatever. Anyways, I apologize for front loading so much of the subject in the first section of the video, but we'll move on to the broader discussion in just a second. Before we do though, it's important to acknowledge that in the case of all pathosync users, the biggest thing that distinguishes them from people who either have no cognitive condition or have the condition but not the pathosync is their ability to inflict it on other people, the transferability that I was talking about. For some, it's just built into the ability. Lyle's reality fabrication inherently affects everyone around him regardless of whether or not he is deliberately roping that person in, and Katari's death delusion is an AoE that hits everyone nearby without her actively consciously controlling it. For others, it's kind of an innate aspect of them that they can't control, like Dada's beast delusion or Alice's camera phobia, and it just kind of happens. They can deliberately cause it to affect others, but it's mostly just sort of a passive status effect they have to endure. For still others, like the Dismemberer's limb severance or Alien's reality collapse, it only affects them unless they choose to inflict it on others, at which point it's a bit of an imprecise weapon. Having any amount of control over a pathosync in the first place is canonically very difficult, and from what we've learned so far, it's a major accomplishment to actually develop a pathosync instead of either going insane or dying or both. Being able to wield it even remotely deliberately is a massive feat, and the people gathered here are largely some of the best of the best on that front. Part of the double-edged sword here is that the power of a pathosync is directly related to how likely it is to get you killed yourself. Lyle's reality fabrication is immensely powerful, but he kept nearly getting hit by cars that he was manifesting into reality by accident. And even before that, the synesthesia nearly broke his brain because of that feedback loop. Limb severance is also obviously very dangerous, but given that you're almost certainly going to chop off your own limbs before you ever get to the point of inflicting on anyone else, it's pretty rare. Meanwhile, camerophobia is pretty easy to be afflicted with and survive, even if it's not necessarily the best quality of life, but as a result, it also has relatively limited power in a killing game. In theory, anyways. I'm sure it'll come up in some interesting ways down the road. Psycho-Sleuth also uses pathosyncs to counter one another in some kind of interesting ways. For example, touching Qatari early on in the game nearly gets them all killed right out of the gate. However, in addition to Eris's robot guide dog named Lyle being unaffected, Dada is also unaffected because death delusion, like I was saying before, affects human beings. And Dada, owing to her pathos convincing her that she is a bird, or maybe a wolf, but definitely not a person, is therefore unaffected as well. Lyle's ability to manifest a weapon into his hands whenever he wants is dangerous, but not just to others, to himself as well, even though he has a fair bit of control over his pathosync. If someone, hypothetically let's say, passes on limb severance or omnidistortion disorder or beast delusion onto him, he could do some real damage to himself and the people around him trying to respond to it. In fact, when he gets hit with limb severance, he nearly does create a knife to slice off his own limbs, only barely stopping himself in time. Perfect memory seems pretty powerful, but it also becomes pretty useless in a hurry in a killing game if the killer decides to use evidentiary occlusion or mnemonic extraction to make it impossible to recall evidence or events. Each character is pretty good at tolerating their own conditions, relatively speaking. They kind of had to be to get to this point and not die, but given that they don't have any experience with any of the others, it can hit them like a truck to suddenly be afflicted by it. After all, if you've never forgotten anything in your life before, and then someone forcibly suddenly removed your memories, how would you manage that? Like, what would that do to you? Not to mention what would happen to you if you suddenly started feeling the overwhelming urge to chop off your own limbs. This is also something Alex touched on a few times in my little mini interview with him, and he specified that the goal was to pick the interpretation of the condition that could manifest as the most useful one to the narrative, both in terms of flexibility and applicability. I'd also personally been curious if there are any lines drawn in the sand in terms of certain conditions or types of conditions being off limit at any stage in the development of this game, but he said there really wasn't, that it was just about what would serve both the individual cases as well as the overarching narrative the best. However, I think at this point we've talked enough about Psycho-Sleuth, at least to start with. You hopefully understand the game and its gimmick by now, so it's time to move on to the broader subject of the video. Part 2. Sensitivity and Sensibility. Whenever I've described Psycho-Sleuth to people, they've kind of had the reaction of like, oh, that sounds like it could be interesting, but it also could be horribly offensive. And that is a pretty understandable reaction. I'm sure that you've at least felt a little bit that way as I've described how its gimmick worked, and I'm not surprised. The idea of turning pretty serious disorders into like magic powers or whatever is kind of objectively insane, and it really does risk mischaracterizing these conditions for a wider audience. This was another thing I asked Alex about, both in terms of whether he or his team had come into that project with those concerns, and if they had talked to any consultants about it to make sure they handled it well. And while he didn't mention any consultants, he did say that they were aware of the risk of it being offensive and wanted to make it clear that they had no intention of offending anyone. They're confident that they can handle the theme well and develop it properly, and while I want to believe them, like I said before, there is a real risk of unintentionally mischaracterizing people with these conditions, even if you do provide a disclaimer up front that you're not trying to comment on real-world conditions. And that concern isn't unfounded or without some precedent. As mentioned throughout the last section, other death games and killing game stories have used psychological conditions as narrative devices before, and within the broader media landscape, that sort of thing is pretty common. Alex says that for him, the idea for this game's specific gimmick, turning disorders into pathosyncs, comes from one of his old light novels, and while I would agree that this is a concept I haven't seen used exactly like this, it is definitely far from the first time it's been used as a narrative device. The most common example of this, I think, is dissociative identity disorder, which is a staple of murder mysteries of all shapes and sizes. The psycho-killer alter of an otherwise normal, seemingly well-adjusted person is a tale as old as time. Or at least, a tale as old as the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, while not literally being DID, is the obvious example of the way the condition is deployed as a trope in modern media. Mr. Hyde keeps on murdering people and then Dr. Jekyll seemingly covers for him, which the story's narrator assumes is the result of Hyde blackmailing Jekyll. In the end, it comes to light that Jekyll had created an elixir that allowed him to transform into Hyde, an alter ego who could indulge his vices without the fear of implicating Jekyll's character. Jekyll originally had control over the transformations via the serum, but at some point began to involuntarily transform into Hyde, and eventually the serum stopped working altogether. Jekyll confessed it all upon realizing he'd permanently become Hyde, and then Hyde killed himself. To reiterate, this is not dissociative identity disorder. Robert Louis Stevenson was not trying to comment on DID, and Jekyll and Hyde aren't just two personalities in the same body. They are two sides of the same personality that have limited knowledge of and control over the other, and to undergo a matching physical transformation. It's more like the substance than anything related to DID. At least, in theory, in the literal text. In practice, though, Jekyll and Hyde have become synonymous in the minds of a lot of people with multiple personality disorder, the older term for DID. Part of why the term was changed from MPD to DID in the DSM-4 was because multiple personalities isn't just an inaccurate way to describe a condition, but one that misled the general public about the nature of it. People with this condition don't just have different personalities that they shift between, but entirely different identities. It's not one identity that shifts between multiple presentations, but multiple whole separate functionally people. Multiple personalities as a term sounds like it describes Jekyll and Hyde if we're speaking colloquially. After all, he basically was using the elixir to create the conditions for his other personality to come out and express itself. And that's a problem for using the term to describe something scientifically. The reason this is important for us is because even if a piece of media does not intentionally attempt to portray a condition, that doesn't mean it can't set the tone for the general public when it comes to that condition. And if I can be super honest, I think this is the source of a lot of my concern when it comes to Psycho-Sleuth. I believe Alex when he says he wants the audience to see the pathless things as distinct from the real-world conditions, and I believe him when he says he doesn't intend to offend or hurt anyone. I believe that the goal of this game is not to try and portray people with these conditions poorly, and I think that they're trying to do their best to avoid that happening unintentionally. But when it comes to this subject, I honestly don't know how possible it is to control the way the audience will interpret it. Jekyll and Hyde are a hugely foundational part of how people see DID, and it not only influences how we treat people with the condition, but how we continue to portray it in the future. Toko Fukawa and Korekyo Shinguji both experience DID and Danganronpa in the ways that play off of that sort of portrayal, with Toko's alter being Genocide Jack and Kyo's being his dead, unnamed sister. Kind of. See, for Toko, it's straightforwardly meant to be DID, which the game is infamously pretty insensitive about, and which is triggered by the abuse she received as a child. She can force herself to swap back and forth sometimes, although it sometimes also happens involuntarily. For Toko, this is a huge part of her lore. Genocide Jack is an infamous serial killer who kills handsome men, and she gets framed in the second trial of Trigger Happy Havoc by someone who decides that just imitating her signature calling card would be funny, so why not defile a corpse, I guess. It's also narratively important, though. Later on in the game, when the characters are told that a bunch of their memories were wiped, they're able to prove that certain details about the state of the outside world are true because only Toko's memories were wiped. Jack's are separate, so she was able to confirm things that the others had forgotten. However, it's also stated that Jack and Toko do share their feelings for people, although it is kind of hard to tell whether this is meant to be literally something that crosses the barrier between the two, or just that the two of them have the same social preferences so feel the same way about people. This ties into a big challenge of portraying any cognitive disorder in media. Namely, we often don't really know how exactly it works, especially for something as hotly contested and controversial as DID. Is it possible for the two identities to share things like their feelings for people? If so, would that make it something other than DID, or would it still meet the criteria? It's not like you can just ask people with the condition either. Even if we assumed that you could find someone who can confirm without a shadow of a doubt is 100% experiencing textbook DID, why would they want to talk to you about it if you're using the info to write a murderer with their condition? The media is a big part of why the condition is so stigmatized, so why would they want to give you a beat-by-beat breakdown of it to make sure you get it as accurate and cutting as possible? And who's to say which parts of what this person is describing are universal aspects of the condition as opposed to individualized experiences of it? What if we are conflating multiple conditions that should be treated as distinct? And that brings us to Korekyo. Kyo has a split personality, but does he have DID? Well, a lot of people treat him like he does, but the reality of it is more complex, especially because it's not like it's just a super easy diagnosis to make. The DSM's current diagnostic criteria includes being recurrently controlled by 2 or more distinct identities, and that there are large gaps in memory that can't otherwise be explained by drugs, alcohol, or some other factor. The problem there is how you establish those facts, especially because of not only the stigma, but also the difficulties in determining what counts as a distinct identity or a substantial gap in memory, and differentiating it from stuff like a kid's imaginary friend. However, for Kyo, we know that he has 2 distinct identities going on, himself and his sister identity, but they don't seem to have the gaps in memory. They're both basically active at all times, or at least one might be in control, but they're both present, I guess, and he can swap between them at will to have a conversation with himself and the other characters. This is also something fun about portrayals of cognitive disorders in fiction, and by fun, I mean not really fun at all. These are fictional characters. They do not have to present with anything resembling realistic symptoms if the writers don't want them to, and at that point it becomes a question of authorial intent, as well as whether that matters. Did Kodaka intend for Korekyo to be read as having DID? Whether he did or not, he didn't exactly meet the diagnostic criteria, so should we accept his intent as fact or try to work with his outcomes to establish what the truth is? This is especially true when we factor in translation and localization, both of which are real hurdles here. I asked Alex about it and he said that it was a huge challenge for them, and I imagine that a big part of that is that the language around cognitive disorders and mental health needs to be hyper-precise in order to communicate exactly what's supposed to be going on with the character. Localization is hard enough just in general when it's not a sensitive subject, but it is very easy to step on toes and get things wrong in a field where context, language, and scientific terminology and definitions really do need to be exactly correct. Double that because this is a subject that nobody on the team seems to have a PhD in or anything, which can also be said for stuff like Zero Escape or Danganronpa or any other game in this genre. It's hard enough to get this stuff right in your native language, much less make sure it stays right throughout the localization process. This is important to remember because, as we mentioned earlier, inaccuracy isn't enough to stop it from affecting the general public. We can see it most obviously with how Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a story that, again, is not about nor describing a character who could be diagnosed with DID by any modern interpretation, influences modern portrayals of DID so heavily. The respectable, intelligent identity with a secret alter as a violent, sadistic, brutal killer is, I think, the most common DID trope out there, especially in killing game media where it introduces a bonus character with unique murder motives. Toko and Jack are a straightforward Jekyll and Hyde situation, even though they're meant to represent DID in a way that Jekyll and Hyde never were. Then you have Kyo, where the split personality thing he's got going on is the result of being tortured nearly to death, but where he was already a killer prior to that, and his sister personality seems to egg him on or encourage him to go through with it. Is that realistic to DID? No, apparently, at least by any definition I can find. But does it still affect how people see people with the condition? Duh. They've been programmed to. They've been trained to see it this way. Sensitivity and sensibility on the subject are hard to come by, and it isn't just with DID. After all, it's not like these conditions are typically conditions of the hero of the narrative. They are the killer's conditions, or at least a pseudo-antagonist, even when it's not a condition associated directly with violence. Ace in 999 has prosopagnosia, and it is his primary motivation for carrying out the experiments that led to the events of the entire franchise. And Rohan Kamakura in Eye the Somnium Files has hemispatial neglect, which is explicitly the motivation behind his murders. Also, it must needs be remarked, DID is not inherently violent, but when portrayed in media, especially killing games, it's almost always treated as though it is. Even when a villain isn't diagnosed in any way by the media itself, that doesn't stop fans from trying to interpret characters like the Danganronpa masterminds or the Zeros in Zero Escape as sociopaths of some flavor. Hell, even when it's not the main villain, nobody with a cognitive condition is usually presented as a good guy. Toko is still largely a villain because of Jack, whereas Korekio is kind of unquestionably presented as a bad guy. Perhaps a victim, depending on your interpretation of him, but not a saint for sure. Aside from Rohan on Eye the Somnium Files, you've got Saito Sejima, who has hypopituitarism, where his brain just doesn't produce oxytocin. Tokiko has a god complex and delusions of grandeur. Terror is seemingly experiencing derealization fairly frequently, and Akemi is basically a rogue alter that was forcibly created by another character who's turned into a VTuber. Psycho-Sleuth, for all of its... well, saying for all of its flaws sounds kind of mean because it really is only a demo and I think there's a lot of potential to get it right, but regardless, for all of its whatever you want to say, it is the first time I've ever played any sort of a video game where having a severe cognitive disorder isn't presented as something that inherently makes someone villainous. And what's more, it doesn't really make them morally anything. Cognitive disorders are being decoupled from moral judgments in a way that we really don't see very often. Even in past instances of media that's tried to be positive representation, it often makes this same mistake of coupling cognitive disorders with morality, just in the opposite direction. Lyle is not a good person, but it's in a way that's a lot more understandable than just, I get the bloodlust because my brain is weird. Like, he's a scammer, but it's not because he has scammer brain. Is it reductive to just interpret OCD as following the rules real good? Obviously, yes. But it's also not like the game just starts and ends Lena's personality at her OCD the way that Toko's entire character becomes dominated by her condition. FaZe's prosopagnosia isn't treated as something that makes her inherently villainous. And you might scoff at the idea of that being an inherently villainous condition, but, again, that was the primary motivation of Ace in 999. Not being able to remember faces was what caused everything to happen in Zero Escape. And what's more, it is much more compelling to use it as a way to tell the story of a character who wants to be reunited with her family but has no way of describing what their faces look like than to just be like, well, he couldn't recognize faces, so he decided to torture children to see if they could do telepathy to fix it. But that's before we even get into the reality that grouping all these things together is, objectively itself, kind of ludicrous. Like, okay, sure, let's just treat hemispatial neglect and hypopituitarism as being on the same page as DID in basically any way. Why not? Cognitive disorders, mental conditions, physiological conditions with psychological symptoms, psychiatric disorders, neurodivergence, all of it gets lumped together here, even if the writers aren't trying to do it, because the framing always puts these sorts of characters into the same sorts of roles. At least with Psycho-Sleuth, it tries to justify it by making the pathos things distinct from the original condition and turning this broad array of conditions into a single unified class of condition. Namely, by adding in the fact that you can inflict it on other people, which justifies grouping them all together. But, I don't know, it really does say something about the way we correlate such a hugely disparate collection of conditions with such a narrow concept of morality, humanity, and decency. Typically, the only exceptions we make are conditions that we treat as being inherently disabling, like dementia or Alzheimer's, but we also tend to associate them with harmlessness, weakness, and generally being pitiable because they involve a perceived lack of autonomy, or such extreme disability that we assume that they couldn't have negative intentions. But again, it is weird to ascribe morality to really any of this. Even for a condition like sociopathy, the condition itself is not inherently immoral or evil. Some conditions might make someone more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors, but there is a fine line between being antisocial and evil. No wonder so many people with these conditions try to hide them or downplay them or avoid treatment or publicity or whatever else. Hell, think about how many people who don't have these conditions but have symptoms commonly associated with one that's perceived super negatively must be avoiding treatment or even discussing it with anyone because they fear being lumped in with the bad ones, even if it means they can't get treatment for the condition that they actually have that just shares a symptom. Imagine how many people will never get treatment for conditions that do have medications or therapies that can help because their understanding of mental illness is like Norman Bates or some shit. Like, I have some reservations about the way that Alex described focusing on the narrative in Psycho-Sleuth and the narrative utility of the pathos and disorders over trying to say something about these conditions or make a statement in general, but in a way, I also think that it's genuinely not a bad idea to explore these conditions in this way that forces them to be perceived through a lens that requires you to accept that a person's morality and their cognitive state are not inherently linked. And as a queer person, I think it's worth acknowledging that we often walk a fine line here as a community as well, and we've been on both sides of it during recent history. It wasn't that long ago that homosexuality was in the DSM, and a big part of the push of gay liberation movements was getting it removed. Why? Well, because treating homosexuality as something fundamentally disordered affects how people treat homosexuals if we assume that disordered cognition is inherently linked to immorality. It also, incidentally, affects how people treat non-homosexuals who are perceived as gay and attaches stigma to innocuous behaviors like interior decorating or, enjoying fruity cocktails because of their associations with disordered behavior. If you believe being gay is a mental disorder, then you will view subjects like conversion therapy, same-sex marriage and adoption, or even health insurance for gay people as just different than otherwise how it would be perceived. It will affect how you approach issues like the AIDS epidemic if you see gay people as people with broken brains that compel them to engage in disordered behavior. Trans people are in a particularly complicated position when it comes to this subject, both because internally within their community as well as within the broader world, this is a hard discussion. Gender dysphoria is a disorder within the DSM-5, and many trans people would argue that that is legitimizing the reality of gender dysphoria and the importance of being allowed to socially and/or medically transition to alleviate that suffering. Others would argue that it medicalizes and generalizes an individual personal experience with gender, and that it stigmatizes trans people far more than just not classifying it as a disorder. Lots of people will also equate gender dysphoria with being trans, even if you are talking about a person who has transitioned and no longer experiences gender dysphoria, which means that they also equate being trans with having a mental disorder. And from there, they pretty easily follow the cultural understanding of that concept into assuming that some sort of villainy, depravity, immorality, or whatever else is associated with it. And again, just like with homosexuality, you tend to see a lot of people getting lumped in who don't necessarily belong to this group, but still share some sort of a characteristic. People who don't necessarily present as perfectly within their binary gender identity that they were assigned at birth might still be associated with transness, and from there, be seen as somehow duplicitous or immoral. It doesn't help that characters like Norman Bates and the ones who clearly pull from that same cultural touchpoint like Korekyo Shinguji blur the lines on this stuff for a lot of people. What's more, leaving gender dysphoria in the DSM also invites quacks like Ray Blanchard to push their way into the conversation and inject their homegrown crackhead bullshit like autogynephilia into it, which then means that the subject has to be discussed even if only to disprove it, which in turn serves to legitimize it by putting it into print in esteemed scientific journals. Removing gender dysphoria from the DSM wouldn't make being trans no longer real any more than removing homosexuality made being gay no longer real, nor would it stop anyone from talking about the subject. All it would do is change the framing and association involved with it, and there are people on both sides of the argument who feel strongly about both options. At one point in time, it is also worth remembering that the progressive, in air quotes, way to talk about homosexuals was as these poor, pitiable wretches on the outside of society. They suffer this terrible affliction that we should feel pity for. They're not deviants or monsters. They're not evil. They're just sick. Like, you can see footage from the very first televised Canadian federal political debate, or federal political debate between the leaders anyways, where that was the position of the new Democratic Party's leader.
What we're really saying is that you must distinguish between sin and crime. And if ever we needed in this country to adopt a new attitude to homosexuality, this is the time. Instead of treating it as a crime and driving it underground, we ought to recognize it for what it is. It's a mental illness. It's a psychiatric condition, which ought to be treated sympathetically, which ought to be treated by psychiatrists and social workers. And we're not going to do this by throwing people into jail.
And while it's definitely an improvement over, the gays are evil, I would argue it's also not necessarily particularly accurate or true to myself as a gay person to be defined by suffering from some compulsive, harmful affliction. Nor do I find it particularly humanizing to be talked about in such terms. But it's also important to reflect on where we do draw that line between morality and neurodivergent cognitive function, and why we do so at all. In fact, we draw a lot of lines here, and many of them are unhelpful, at least if the goal is to get an understanding of people. They can be helpful if the goal is to draw lines between us and them. For example, see how people talk about high-functioning or low-functioning autistic or ADHD people. Hell, people struggle to understand that intelligence and neurodivergence don't share a purely causal relationship in a lot of the same ways as they struggle to understand the lack of a perfect causal relationship between morality and neurodivergence. Plenty of people with ADHD are very smart and plenty are very dumb. Plenty are very good people and plenty are very bad people. Plenty are very polite people and plenty are very rude people. And of course, a ton of this is genuinely very subjective. If you ask autistic people, you'll hear the argument very frequently that it is infinitely more rude to speak to and about people in coded double talk, where you refuse to just say what you actually mean than it is to just be blunt and honest. Lots of neurodivergent people would make the case that just because it is a social convention to behave a certain way doesn't mean it's inherently good, or nice, or correct to behave that way, and that they are not in the wrong, they're just different. What's more, they would probably argue that it's only within their specific context that they are being perceived this way. Someone with autism who struggles to pick up on social cues will stick out far more among a southern crowd where everything is a euphemism to be decoded than they will in a place like, Germany, where blunt language is kind of just what they do. That's really what a lot of this comes down to, an understanding of neurodivergence as being different and contextual, but not something inherently or fundamentally good or bad. But all of this is exploring the what of it all. What are we doing? What are we talking about? What are the ramifications and implications of it all, etc.? Maybe we should be reframing it around a different question, one that might help explain the motivations behind these sorts of betrayals. Part 3. But why? It's all well and good to talk about what's so bad about this stuff or what's going on, but it's arguably far more important to talk about why this is how cognitive disorders are portrayed. What purpose is being served by doing all this? What end are we trying to achieve? What is the narrative utility of it? I mean, those are technically what questions, but they're all about exploring the why. Why is this happening in media? Why do so many creatives seem to want to explore these same tropes regarding mental illness and cognitive disorders in the same ways over and over again across time and genre? And the answer is complicated, but I think it comes down to a few key motivations. I mean, they're an easy way to write off complicated, seemingly illogical behavior and motivations without having to think about it. They allow us to assume that evil is the result of some intrinsic flaw in a defective person rather than something that a normal person like ourselves could be capable of. And also, the idea of a person whose brain works in a fundamentally different way is uniquely scary for a lot of reasons. On that first point, it's pretty straightforward. If your character's motivation is that they're crazy, then their actions just don't need to make sense. Toko Fukawa has one of the classic dangerous crazy person TM conditions, so people don't even bat an eye at the idea that she's also a serial killer. It'd be a whole lot harder to write that story without DID because you'd have to explain how and why a teenage girl who is a renowned romance novelist and a pretty timid, shy person was also a serial killer on the side, even though functionally speaking, the DID diagnosis doesn't do much to answer any of those questions. Like, Jack still looks pretty recognizably like Toko, and she still has to use the same body and muscles and height to commit all these crimes, so like, how does that happen? Toko is still absolutely tiny, which means Jack is absolutely tiny. The only hurdle it actually helps you clear is why would she kill people? By saying that she wouldn't, but her alter would. And it relies on you assuming that every alter is either a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation where the normal facade hides an evil alter, or a Norman and Norma Bates situation where the primary is the killer but is being egged on by the alter. It never actually answers why Genocide Jack is a serial killer. Like, we know why Genocide Jack exists, we know about the trauma, we know the motivations of Genocide Jack kind of in the abstract, but there's no explanation for why Toko has developed an alter that is a serial killer, or why that's just kind of kept happening. But thanks to how we perceive both mental disorders in general, as well as DID specifically, it doesn't have to. And when it comes to the conditions that aren't so closely associated with violence and antisocial behavior, there's still an assumption that being motivated by the suffering caused by a disabling condition can drive you crazy and motivate you to go way too far. The idea of suffering from prosopagnosia is assumed to be one that the audience would recognize as being so awful that it could motivate someone to create the nonary games, kidnapping and torturing children just to try and find a cure. Don't get me wrong, prosopagnosia sounds like a very hard thing to deal with for sure, but like, so does being deaf. And I think if anyone ever tried to write a Zero Escape-esque story where the villain's motivation was, I thought doing all of this would help me recover my hearing, we'd recognize that as being both patently absurd and pretty dramatically ableist. I think a lot of us have had a thought at one point or another in our lives that went along the lines of, if I went blind or deaf or lost my legs or became paralyzed, I would rather just die than live like that. And like, as much as I'm not proud of it, I've definitely had that thought myself. However, that sort of thinking is not only obviously pretty hurtful to a lot of people who are living fulfilling lives but are being told that the idea of living like them is worse than death, but also enables this sort of cheap, easy narrative contrivance. Disability is so awful a concept to so many of us that it's assumed that we can empathize with, or at least understand, a man being so motivated to no longer be disabled that he's willing to incinerate a 12-year-old on the sister ship of the Titanic if it means he might be freed from this disability. The second motivation is that it provides an easy answer for us, too. Not just in fiction, but in the real world. Part of what makes it so hard to confront evil in the world is that we truly don't want to see ourselves reflected in it. Not just literally, but even theoretically. We want to be able to recognize the Nazis as uniquely evil, the result of a uniquely flawed German psyche, or a uniquely evil set of collaborators, or uniquely unjust set of historical conditions, because that makes us feel better about never having to confront the possibility of who we might become if push came to shove. We could never be that because we're not them. We are us. This is especially true for us in the modern day because history helps us create distance and avoid acknowledging not only modern day parallels, but also how we can end up being complicit in the same ways that we were all shocked that anyone could just let things slide when we learned about it in a history class. We want to be able to attribute murder and violence to this group of people who aren't just like us. They're broken, damaged in some way we aren't, which gives us distance from them. To be very clear, this goes well beyond cognitive disorders. People jump at any opportunity to make sure they never see themselves reflected in evil, whether that's on neurodivergence, gender, race, class, status, religion, or whatever else. However, cognitive disorders are uniquely powerful as an argument on this front because they function on two levels. First, they position us as normal, as opposed to them who are abnormal. If we associate the evil with the abnormal, then evil is associated with them and not us. Fundamentally, it's not an us characteristic. Even more powerfully than that, a cognitive disorder means that we get basically carte blanche to say whatever we want about the person's motivations and actions and behaviors because we're operating on the basis of their brain and their thought processes work so fundamentally different to us, to our own, that we are incapable of understanding just why they would act this way. Only that they do act this way. When it comes to media, this is appealing for writers because it means that they don't actually have to write a motivation that's logical or relatable for an evil action a character takes because, they can assume the audience will let it slide. It's a crazy person acting crazy. So of course we, the sane ones, just naturally wouldn't be able to understand their logic. Like, our brains just work too well to understand that crazy person. It's uniquely appealing to us in a way that any other broad oversimplification of a group of people isn't, because it is fundamentally built on top of the idea that the neurodivergent people are so intrinsically different from us that we don't have to reckon with how we might also be driven to that kind of behavior. Even people who might be associated with the them will try to find a way to split hairs here, to try and convince others and themselves that they're part of the us. This happens with a lot of neurodivergent people. You'll see it among autistic people where someone will try and differentiate themselves from others, or people with ADHD who will try and differentiate themselves. But it also happens in many other categories. An obvious example right now is the LGB without the T bullshit that's going on right now, where a handful of cis, white, gay, lesbian, and bi people are trying to draw the line between themselves and trans people to argue that they're part of the in-group. They're the normal gays. They're basically straight people who just happen to have a same-sex attraction affliction, as opposed to being one of the freaks, the queers, the them, the they-them. Neurodivergence is a particularly powerful version of this, though, because it can intersect with literally any other group, so you can always find a way to pivot towards it if you need to. Either to associate an evil action with them on the grounds of their neurodivergence, so it's not associated with a characteristic like race, religion, or gender that you might share with the perpetrator of an evil act, or to associate the characteristic that you've pre-positioned as evil with another them that you're trying to drag down with them. When the school shooter is white, conservative commentators will argue that they're either trans or autistic or neurodivergent in some other way. But when the shooter is black or brown, they'll point to race or religion. The third reason, and arguably the most compelling one, is that it is very easy to make cognitive disorders very, very scary. On the most simple level, the idea that being unable to rely on your own perception and cognition of reality is genuinely terrifying. And so the idea of being afflicted with something like hemispatial neglect or body integrity dysphoria is understandably scary to us. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was a horror story, and while it wasn't accurate to DID or whatever else, the thing that makes it so horrifying still resonates with how we perceive conditions like DID. Even compared to how we perceive physical disabilities, cognitive ones are on a whole other level because it affects not just how we interact with the world, but how we perceive it, and what we perceive as fundamentally human about ourselves. Our emotions, our thoughts, our ideas, our worldview, all of that. On a broader level, so much of how we operate in our day-to-day lives is built on the assumption that everyone else is also more or less on board with reality and the social contract, that they can be expected not to drive through a stop sign, or not to push you down and steal your money, or whatever else. that they will also agree that punching someone in the face for no good reason is a bad thing to do and that hurting someone that way would be wrong. We want to be able to believe that everyone thinks like us because it makes us feel safe. After all, I would never mug someone in the parking lot, so anyone who shares my thought process also wouldn't do that. We all have common sense, basically. This is something that, again, also appears in any form of discrimination or characterization. Racists will assume that black people are inherently violent and therefore that they aren't safe even around black people who appear to be acting the same way that they are because there must be some inherent violence lurking under the surface. There is also sometimes a level of projection involved in all of this, such as how so many straight men are scared and hostile towards queer men because they assume that they'll objectify or harass them as objects of their desire the same way that they do to women as their objects of desire. However, again, with neurodivergence, it's especially powerful because of that idea that this person's brain is fundamentally unrecognizable to you in terms of thought processes. Like, can you imagine the idea of just neglecting the entire concept of the left? I mean, if you're a modern liberal party, yes, but in theory, it's meant to be harder than that. Can you wrap your head around the idea of being derealized and perceiving the world as if it is through a movie screen? Can you put yourself in the shoes of someone who shares those shoes with another identity in that body? In a lot of cases, it's such a fundamentally foreign feeling experience that it is innately a little scary. And that makes neurodivergent people uniquely useful as villains because they are often invisible. And that doesn't just make them effective villains in media, but also in the real world. It allows us to weaponize the label of mental illness as a tool against not only marginalized people who we want to turn into some fundamentally unrecognizable other, but also anyone we just don't want to help. Like, just listen to how conservatives, or even a lot of liberals, talk about homeless people or drug addicts and you'll see what I mean. We see so much distance between ourselves and the mentally ill or cognitively disabled or neurodivergent that just attaching those labels to them allows so many people to justify the inhumanity done to them in encampment raids or forced evictions or shutting down rehab centers. Even if we're not talking about justifying actions, just listen to how they're talked about. They're talked about like animals roaming the streets. Like, talk to someone in Vancouver about East Hastings Street and see how they act like they're rabid dogs, not people. In fiction, it serves the purpose of not only creating a villain who is scary because we don't recognize their motivations and logical structures, but also because it's a lot easier for the audience to be on board with the narrative punishing the villain if we see them as something less human than ourselves. I think this is why the villain of Process of Elimination is so much more impactful for me than so many other similar villains. Their motivation is never really presented as the result of neurodivergence or anything of the sort. If anything, they're acting in a perfectly logical way that we are able to put ourselves in the shoes of, and that makes their arguments so much more compelling and concerning. Go watch my Process of Elimination video for more on that. But maybe in all of this, you don't really see a problem with these sorts of portrayals. Like, sure, it's definitely complicated, but you might also feel compelled to point out that a condition like DID is not only very different from us, but also not inherently portrayed or interpreted from a position of malice. And I think you're not wrong, at least to some extent. Toko Fukawa, for all of the many issues with her portrayal, is still clearly a character that the writer likes and want you to like too. They are one of the only Danganronpa characters to get to come back, and like get to come back in a playable sense, not just in a cameo in the final act. While basically everyone in the 100 line is dealing with some sort of cognitive issue, it's hard to argue that a character like Darumi Amamiya is written in a way that's meant to reflect negatively on people who see a similarity in her. In fact, she's pretty transparently the writer's stand-in, and Kodaka and Uchikoshi were both clearly having a lot of fun writing her and want her to be seen as a three-dimensional human being, not just in spite of her cognitive issues, but with those as part of who she is. And setting aside obviously over-dramatized narratives like Psycho-Sleuth, it's not like these conditions don't exist in the real world in some context. Like, should they be off limits altogether? Is it problematic to acknowledge that they exist? Am I the friend who's being too woke? Part 4. Is it problematic? I mean, the answer is obviously that it's contextual. Sometimes the portrayal absolutely is, and in a lot of cases these stories are written by creatives who are so out of their depth that they can't help but make it harmful and portray people inaccurately. But hey, let's assume that we're talking about a scenario in which the writer is perfectly knowledgeable about a condition like DID. They have done mountains of research, they are an expert, they've got their degree, they've consulted with tons of people with the condition, and they still decide they want to write a Toko Fukawa into their story. Is that problematic? And on that front, I don't know. On one hand, I would argue that swinging the pendulum too far in the opposite direction and treating people with DID as if they are infantilized and pitiable wretches who deserve empathy and a place to suffer in peace would not only really be inaccurate, but also pretty ableist. There's been a trend across a lot of neurodivergent discussions to point out that when we assume that someone can't do something, then we never give them the opportunity to do it, and so they never do it. Maybe when we're not constantly seeing people with disabilities being presented as evil masterminds, it would be possible to portray them as full, complex human beings, which includes allowing them to be flawed people or even bad people that are being inherently ableist. On the other hand, even in this hypothetical scenario, surely there's a limit somewhere, right? Like, being knowledgeable about a subject doesn't magically mean you get a pass to invoke every single harmful trope or stereotype, especially because the author's perfect knowledge does not extend to the audience. Just because the author has spoken to every person with DID in the world, or hell, let's lower the stakes and just say every person with autism in the world, does that suddenly mean that the audience has the same breadth of knowledge and insight? A writer has to write to their audience, and given the real lack of education on the subject among the general public coupled with the wild portrayals in popular culture, it's not hard to argue that even if the writers might know what they're doing, that doesn't mean that they'll find an audience that'll match them. On the other hand, you might argue that the purpose of a story isn't to moralize to us, at least not inherently. It's to tell a story, and it's not ableist to acknowledge the idea of a person with multiple identities opening the door for a ton of options in a narrative that just otherwise wouldn't exist, or that their condition would obviously affect their daily life. Acknowledging aspects of a person's identity, or person's multiple identities, isn't the same as denouncing those things. And even if some of the parts of that person's identity aren't perfectly flattering, isn't it more problematic to paint over the reality of living with a condition like this just to make yourself and your audience feel more comfortable about it? Is it progressive to just stick a smiley face on a condition as impactful as DID and pretend it's all okay? Or is it more authentic and accurate to acknowledge how hard that life can be and the impacts it can have on a person? Or on the people around them? Like, that is something worth considering too. On the other hand, is it truly the epitome of storytelling to fall back on, oh, they were insane and that's why they did it, as a climax to the narrative? Or even just for it to be some random B-plot to add tension? Is it truly so compelling for your DID character to be a serial killer? Like, wow, you're telling me that someone in this murder mystery narrative has a secret second personality that's evil and that was the culprit all along? Not only is that kind of hack bullshit, and we've seen it a billion times, but it's also just an objectively lazy Deus Ex Machina to provide a resolution when you can't think of a real way to end the story you've written. Even setting aside whether or not it's problematic, is it really a twist if we've seen it done a million times? Like, if we want to argue that this is valid to include because it's compelling narratively, doesn't that argument no longer exist if it's been done so much? You could argue it'd be one thing if this presentation was at least novel, but it just isn't. And if you're just viewing neurodivergence as a way to open up more narrative options when it comes to presenting a villain but never a hero or even a neutral character, aren't you just using the realities of struggling with these conditions as a get-out-of-jail-free card? Is it truly adding to the narrative of Zero Time Dilemma to decide that actually Mira's some vaguely sociopathic Saito Sejima-adjacent serial killer who just cuts out everyone's hearts so she can feel something? Was it worth it to retcon the origin story for Akane and functionally the entire franchise just to make it so this random asshole's at fault for everything that happened? Like, did it meaningfully improve the narrative just to have her occasionally wander around and murder people because she's crazy? Like, even in the narrative, Delta had no control over her and pretty much just exclusively brought her along to be an obnoxious loose cannon who ruins everything. He just wakes her up and she unthinkingly goes, oh, well, time to get some murdering, I guess. Like, she's literally stuck in the torture chamber with everyone else and has major secrets revealed to her as part of this that, might help her get out, like the fact that it's all one big complex. And she could use that at least for herself, if not everyone, but instead she just mindlessly kills people because she thinks she can get away with it. Or even if she doesn't think she can get away with it, she just feels compelled to. Like, I'm loath to be the kind of person who's on Twitter whining about, but was it narratively essential for there to be sex or violence or drugs in this scene? But I do think at some point it is genuinely worth asking if there is anything being added by taking this approach that justifies it. And look, this sort of argument could theoretically go back and forth forever. And that's even before getting into every single condition that's out there. These conditions are real, but is there a correct way to portray any of them? Is there a way that isn't problematic? Is it more problematic to just erase these people from our literature and film and television and video games as if they never existed? How we handle this discussion for DID is also going to be totally different from how we handle it for autism or sociopathy or ADHD or prosopagnosia or any of the countless other conditions that all get lumped in together under this massive umbrella. Is it even realistic to assume that we could come to any sort of conclusion about any of this? How are we even supposed to get everyone on the same basic level of understanding? Like, there's not a lot of education out there. But that actually brings me to another big part of this discussion. Part 5. Educate yourself. Part of the problem is that we have very little standardized, formalized education on the subject that's widely available, so this media often defines these conditions for us regardless of the creator's intent. A big reason why representation matters isn't just that it's inherently good to see queer characters or characters of color or whatever else, but that it also helps to impart a broader picture of these groups onto the audience that allows you to see the range of expressions of self that can exist within a group that you aren't intimately personally familiar with. Like, that means the goal is that when you see a black villain or a gay villain, your brain isn't jumping to, oh, black equals villain or gay equals villain. It hopefully means that you're capable of seeing both aspects of the character without assuming an association or correlation between them. However, we also have to recognize that these sorts of conditions are also very complicated individualized subjects, meaning that it is hard to really know what the experience is like. And that can lead to mischaracterization of real people no matter how hard we try. Even if we do try to educate ourselves, the reality of the situation is that a lot of this stuff will fly over the average person's head. And that's assuming that the materials out there are actually accurate to begin with. Cognitive issues are massively complicated and controversial even within academic and scientific communities, and there is frequently very little consensus about what a quote-unquote typical person with any given condition would behave like. Like, I focused a lot on DID in this video because it's the easiest one that most of us are familiar with, and it is a simple enough premise for everyone to kind of grasp the basics of what we're talking about, but a lot of these conditions are still very confusing in terms of causes, symptoms, and more, including DID. Hemispatial neglect is something that we're kind of getting a grasp on, but even then, it's hard to isolate it because it's often the result of some kind of traumatic brain injury or stroke that comes with other conditions as well, and that makes it hard to isolate. And then there's something like aphantasia, where a ton of people randomly learn they might have it because of a stupid fucking Twitter meme because they literally never thought about it before, and without the internet, it's hard for a lot of people to have a discussion about what they see in their mind when they picture something. And what's more, we don't even know what it might mean for someone to have aphantasia. Like, is it indicative of something more serious? Or is it just one of those weird, quirky things where humans are sometimes different in kind of inexplicable ways that don't really matter much, like the cilantro tasting like soap gene? And you might think there that the answer is just, let's defer to the experts, but then that begs the question of who gets to be an expert? When it comes to cognitive issues and disability in general, there's often very little overlap between people in the group and people who get to be experts about the group. Lots of people are just straight up bullshitting about how different people interact with the world based on basically just vibes and stereotypes. Again, Ray Blanchard is a good example of a moron getting to be treated like an authority on a marginalized group and condition that he has no actual knowledge of or experience with. And he gets to be treated like an authority over the voices of the many, many trans people who say that he is full of shit and that what he's talking about doesn't reflect what they experience at all. So, like, who is an expert on DID? Who is an expert on aphantasia? Even if there's someone who's coming in with good intentions and without biases and all that, there's still every possibility that they are just wrong. The brain is confusing and complex, and it's really, really hard to understand why it does stuff sometimes. It's like how we can understand what forces make an airplane fly, but we don't actually understand why those forces exist. Like, even the experts in a field like psychiatric medicine or cognitive disorders or neuroscience or whatever else are still going to run into things that they can't objectively know and so have to kind of theorize on. And they often have to keep building theories on top of theories long before the original ones can be proven true or false. And that's not to say that experts are useless, though, or that lived experience is the only thing that matters, especially when it's so hard to prove who is actually speaking from lived experience. It is very easy on the internet to assume an identity that you don't have, and if you're going around on Twitter looking for people with DID, you'll only end up finding the kinds of people who are going around advertising they have DID on Twitter, which I would argue is unlikely to be a representative sample. It's like wanting to understand gay people better, but exclusively pulling your sources from Folsom. Like, sure, you might meet a bunch of people who meet the brief, but you're going to get a lot of people who share a lot of perspectives and characteristics in a way that might make you think they're all connected to being gay when, in reality, you just went to a place that only attracts people who share that specific combination of characteristics. And that's before we even touch on how AI has just fucking obliterated the internet and filled everything with useless bots and digital hallucinations that just make it a bad idea to trust anything you find on there, because even if you try to fact check it, you might just run into more generative AI garbage that misinforms you. And obviously, like, educating yourself probably isn't the solution, but a lot of these systemic forces will still exist in actual formalized education as well. Anyone who's any amount of neurodivergent or physically disabled has run into the reality that a lot of supposedly well-educated professionals in the field of medicine are clearly just kind of dipshits who don't really care about you, and are just regurgitating baseless nonsense that they heard from some idiot. A big issue when it comes to diagnosis of conditions like DID is that a lot of doctors, even specialists in the field, aren't always super well trained to recognize, identify, and diagnose the condition in a way that rules out all the alternatives. And that's not because all experts are dumb or uncaring or whatever. Like, this isn't an argument for the Facebook doctors. Lots of people are trying their best, but just cannot possibly know everything about such niche and complicated subjects. We are all still learning and growing and trying to figure out the complexities of our own brains. We're like computers trying to figure out how to be a computer. And have you seen generative AI try to program software? Like, that shit's dumb as hell and it's wrong about basically everything. And occasionally just deletes it all for no good reason. Like, we're a lot smarter than AI, but it is genuinely an astronomical challenge to try and map out every nuance of the human brain with human brains. And so while it's important to be critical, we also need to be understanding about the reality of the complexity of the subject at hand and operate accordingly. But like, that doesn't really give us an answer either. What do we do about this stuff? How should mental illness be handled in killing games? Or even just media in general? Part 6. The tricky bit. At the end of the day, the answer is that there probably isn't a right way to do it. At least, not right now. There are definitely a lot of wrong ways, don't get me wrong there, but I don't really know what the right answer to that is, especially because we're kind of naturally talking about a self-selecting genre of media here. Of course, mental illness in a killing game is going to be portrayed in terms of how it's associated to violence and conflict and social interaction, where paranoia and confusion and deception are the name of the game. And of course, that will almost certainly lean into the negative aspects of the stereotypes there. It does with everyone. Nobody is their best self in a killing game. I've talked a lot about Toko Fukawa here because she's more directly connected to this video's subject, but ironically, in focusing so heavily on her and other characters like her in isolation from their stories, I've replicated the same sort of failure of evaluation that Ray Blanchard committed with his research into trans people. Namely, I've failed to contextualize my findings of how other members of other groups also behave under similar conditions. Look at how the other characters in those stories are portrayed. Celestia Ludenberg faked a sexual assault allegation against a male character to motivate another man to kill him for her, and then from there killed him. Miyake Tagami straight up caught someone else committing a murder, and rather than doing anything to hold them accountable, he decided to just defile a corpse and string it up like a toy just to fuck with Toko by making her think that Genocide Jack had done it. So many of the characters were cruel as fuck to Sakura Ogami throughout that game, and when she tried to make amends, multiple characters all tried to kill her. Then, when she killed herself, Aoi Asahina tried to stage the crime scene to frame the others so they'd vote wrong and all get executed because she felt like they all deserved to die for how they pushed Sakura to suicide. Sayaka Maizono attempted to kill Leon Kawada, but after he fought her off and she was well and truly unable to fight back hiding in the bathroom, he still went and got his toolkit from his room, took the doorknob off the door, then kicked in the bathroom door to stab her to death. Junko Enoshima murdered her own sister purely to prove a point to the others and because causing herself despair brought her so much satisfaction. I mean, with Junko, you could probably argue that there is some mental illness going on somewhere in there, but she did end the world basically out of pure boredom because she was just so smart. Nobody covers themselves in glory in Danganronpa, even the survivors. Toko was never knowingly willing to throw Makoto to the wolves even though she knew he was innocent the way that Kyoko was. She wasn't prepared to kill everyone and herself the way Aoi was. She didn't defile any corpses during the killing game like Byakuya did. Note that I said during the killing game, and also note that it's not technically Toko, it's Genocide Jack. And she also just wasn't completely useless throughout the game like Yasuhiro was. All equally terrible things to do. If we compare her across the entire franchise, it's not really like you could say she's portrayed as some uniquely evil character by their standards, or even the only pre-game murderer. There's a lot of them. Fuyuhiko is the ultimate Yakuza for Christ's sake. He's definitely killed plenty of people before the games, both directly and indirectly, and he really doesn't seem to feel very much guilt about it. And that's before we even get into the fact that the ultimate despair stuff happens and turns his entire class into just straight up monsters who do some really fucked up shit. Canonically, someone's cut off their own hand and replaced it with Junko's. Someone else did the same with Junko's eye, and one character did it with her ovaries. By the standards of Danganronpa, it's hard to really argue that Toko's portrayed as being particularly worse than anyone else. Sure, it's maybe not the best portrayal of DID, but it's also not like it's, uniquely evil or cruel as far as the game's standards go. The one time during the series where she did kind of try to kill someone with Sakura, but importantly, it was as Genocide Jack, and even then, she literally only did the exact same thing that Yasuhiro had done first. That's kind of the point of that case, is that she didn't do something unique and she didn't do it first. And the reality is that people do exist with these conditions in the real world, and also that I don't think it's inherently a bad thing to want to explore how someone with a very different way of processing the world might handle a killing game or a death game or just a high-stress narrative in general. What's more, I think Psycho-Sleuth demonstrates that it is possible to incorporate these conditions directly into this sort of narrative in a way that is actually pretty compelling without being so reductive in terms of just reducing them down to their condition. Paradoxically, by inflicting a disorder on every character and making it central to not only their individual character but the entire game, it forces you to engage with the characters beyond just the disorder. By making that the gimmick, it makes it hard to not engage with the characters beyond just that. It's like how Danganronpa, by centering the ultimate nature of its students, puts everyone on an even playing field to some extent. If everyone's an ultimate, then just being ultimate isn't in and of itself a defining character trait. Not that it isn't necessarily the most sensitive or accurate way to handle it in the case of Psycho-Sleuth, but is also not just mental illness equals evil or something, and it does allow for characters to have depth and motivation in social interactions that aren't just limited to what's explicitly relevant to their cognitive issues. Sure, it's going to be a tricky subject to navigate, and sure, I don't think that turning mental illnesses into magic powers is exactly the solution to it, but I do think that something Psycho-Sleuth actually does get right for sure is that it recognizes that its characters are still at their cores people like us. They might have some pretty substantial differences in a lot of different ways, and sometimes it makes them act in a way that we could never dream of, but the game also makes an effort to actually put you in their shoes to understand why it makes them act the way they do. And what's more, it doesn't just do it to horrify the audience. It often uses it to make a point about what the characters are going through as they live their lives and how jarring and disabling their conditions would be if they were just suddenly dropped on you out of nowhere, and even how their mental issues can play a role in some awful things. But aside from some exceptions like Atari, which I think is not the best way to handle any of that, it regularly allows the characters to be shown existing normally with their conditions basically just running in the background. It doesn't hesitate to remind you that they are still carrying a lot of weight on their shoulders and that they've all had to learn how to hold back the tide without looking like they're holding so much as a garden hose. But it also just allows them to talk, to be, to exist in reality alongside one another and everyone else as flawed characters, human beings, seeing one another as people who have personalities that are unquestionably influenced by what they've gone through and the unique nature of their cognitive realities, but are still able to stand alone in a way that is fundamentally human of them. Except for Dada, who is fundamentally a bird. Kind of. And that's where this one's going to end. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you've enjoyed this one. It was a very weird, very challenging video to work on, if I'm being 100% honest with you, and I have been worried basically the entire time about biting off more than I could chew, but hopefully I've done the subject justice. Hopefully. I mean, it's done now. Anyway, thank you as well, I should say, to Alex, Lou, and Fospo, both for reaching out and offering me early access to Psycho-Sleuth, and for being so willing to answer my questions. I have not been paid anything or promised anything or offered any sort of even implicit compensation for talking about this game, and at no point has anyone at Fospo attempted to impose any conditions on me when it comes to how I should speak about this game if I wanted to be able to ask the questions I've asked, and I want to make that clear here before I say that if you got this far, I think you should put Psycho-Sleuth on your wishlist for when it comes out. It'll be linked in the description, hopefully if I remember to do so, so just be sure to keep an eye on it. Also, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more, and consider becoming a channel member if you haven't already. Members contribute $5 or more a month on either YouTube or Patreon to support the channel and get to vote for one video topic a month. And this is the one they picked for November. The December video, Why Video Games Struggle to Get Mysteries Right, was actually an old topic from over a year ago that never really got any votes, so I dropped it, but after it was overwhelmingly selected to be resurrected by the community, the membership also overwhelmingly voted for it. So, ta-da, that'll be coming out next. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members, both now and from when this topic was selected. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Anja Tenar, Bailey Nichols, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, and NJD. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Kavos, Crimson Cyclo, Catlover192, Corey, MB, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meeped Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safan, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Teo Tamara, Puddinsis, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Ismi, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Neelost, Prism, Lily Hero, Mitzicore, and Bubble Boy. Plus, a special shout out to Kiri for your contributions to the 2.0 Donathon. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just somebody who decided to click on this video, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.